Hi and welcome back to my channel. This week I'm going to show you how to paint this delicious calorie-free cupcake in watercolour. I'm Helen Campbell and my channel is all about helping beginners grow. So let's get straight into the tutorial, but if you are new here, consider subscribing below and hitting that bell so you'll be notified every Tuesday when I upload new content. So without any further ado, let's get started. So as usual, I've started my painting by doing a really simple line drawing. If you'd like to know how I do my drawings, I will put an information card on the top of the screen right now. So I work from photographs and I will put the reference photograph for this cupcake at the very end of this tutorial. So I have some clean water, my paper towels so that I can pat my brush on, and my colour chart so that I can match my colours up. If you'd like to know how to make a colour chart like this, I will put an information card on the top of the screen right now. The paper that I'm using today is Daler Rowney Mixed Media at £169, and the reason I'm using mixed media paper is because quite simply I want to make art accessible to everybody, and not everybody has Arches or any fine grade watercolour paper within their stash. Painting should be for everybody, and I'm going to show you how you don't need fancy paper to create really good results. We're going to be working wet on wet to begin with, and I have my colour mixed here. I have actually two petals which are pretty much the same. They are indigo, which probably will surprise you because it's a really dark blue colour, and we also have sap green, and it will give you this really pale green, which is what we want for the icing on this mint cupcake. I'm going to put it over the chocolate button, and I'll explain why in a moment. I'm putting the green colour on there as well. So to begin with, it's just plain water. Wet on wet is a fantastic way of painting for really sort of faster results. And if you're nervous about painting in watercolour, it's a really good way of getting over your nervousness of painting, because all you're doing is painting water onto paper. The bottom layer is going to be a chocolate layer, but again, it doesn't matter because this is all kind of part of the same section. So all over like this. So once you've painted the colour, pick up your pigment, and a really good tip is have your paint mixed before you apply your water. So this can get dropped in where you've applied the water, and it will just settle in really nicely. Because I've used indigo as part of my mix, indigo is very similar to Payne's Grey, which I use quite a lot in my paintings. And Payne's Grey and indigo can be used to do this really cool thing, which I'll come back to in a bit, which is why I've gone over the chocolate button. So I'll explain that a bit later on. We're just going to let that dry. So while we're waiting for that to dry, I have a mix here of indigo, which we've already used, along with a tiny bit of burnt umber, and this is going to form the sort of easy chocolate pot here. So it's still kind of a little bit damp, so we don't want it to go on to this section here, but we're perfectly fine to drop this in. Now we will need to add texture and more depth of tone to this, but at the moment we just need to drop this colour in. And if it does bleed a little bit into the existing tones, don't worry, it will just give it a nice organic look, but we don't want it to go too far up into the mint colour that we've applied. So I'm using a number 6 size spotter. This one's from Rosemary & Co, and they make the most wonderful brushes. I can't recommend them highly enough. So I'm just using this, dropping it in like this. This is our base colour for our chocolate element of the chocolate cake. Okay, so this can just get dropped in and working around the mint leaf that we have here. And like I said, I'm going to put the reference photograph right at the very end of this video. It just gives you an idea of what I'm working with and working from. And like I said, we're going to add some more texture and tonal variations with this. If you're new to watercolour painting, it's all about adding layers to your paint to create form and realism. So this can go like this. Now where this colour has bled into the cake, I'm just going to remove a tiny bit of that by cleaning my brush, patting it on my kitchen towel, and then just moving it out of the way like that. And again, and that's cleaned that up. The chocolate button will need to be a lot darker, but I'm just going to put this colour on as a base tone again. I'm just switching my brush to a slightly smaller one. I'm going to go with a number 4 size spotter. I'm going to pick up this colour. When I said earlier on about Payne's grey and indigo being really cool colours to have, you can do really sort of magical things with them. This will make sense in a minute. This chocolate button here, for example, I've applied, and it probably didn't make sense at the beginning. I'm going to just paint this sort of muddy, murky colour around the outside of where we've applied that green tone. But I'm not going to take it all the way to the edge. I'm just using this brush to apply wet on dry now. Okay, right up to the edge like that, and we have a jagged edge right here. Cleaning my brush and patting it on the kitchen towel, and then what I'm going to do is just wiggle it around like this, creating this little highlight. I'm just pulling the existing paint on the brush around, and this colour underneath will now create this really natural looking highlight. If we had left that piece of paper as it was, as in a sort of white paper colour, it wouldn't have looked natural. But because we have this grey bluey tone underneath, it gives a really natural looking highlight. And all I'm going to do now is let that settle in before we carry on with building up our colours and getting the chocolate colour to be a really kind of cool chocolate tone and build up our colours slowly. I've now mixed a little more of the same 2 colours into this mixture here. So I have burnt umber along with a tiny bit of indigo. Indigo will give it that sort of chocolatey brown colour like this. So now that this chocolate button, the base tone of it is dry, we can start to add the more chocolatey tone here. We want to keep the mid-tone underneath. Okay, so we're just putting this colour in like this, cleaning my brush and then just blending it into the existing colour. And when you're doing this method of painting, you just want to use little by little. You don't want to paint, you always paint a lot less paint on than you think you're going to need, because as you're blending it into itself, obviously you're going to lose some of that colour. So that's going to stay like that for the moment, and then we can start to think about building it up completely. And I'm going to add a tiny bit more indigo and put the indigo colour on the outside edge like that to give it this really dark chocolate button. Indigo is a really good colour adjuster, and if you haven't got indigo, use Payne's grey, works just as well. You might want to add a little bit of a bluey tone to it, but essentially it's the same thing. Like I said, these tutorials are all about making art accessible to everybody. If you don't have that colour, use what you have. Right, so we're getting around the outside of this, like that. Gone outside the pencil line, but it doesn't matter, we can enlarge the button, like so. So you can see already that this chocolate button has a really sort of good 3-dimensional feel to it. Now I'm going to let that settle, and I'm going to turn my attention back to the cupcake itself. So I have 2 puddles of paint on my palette now. This colour here, this is sap green on its own, and I'm going to apply this straight onto the mint leaf, the mint leaves that you see. Okay, that's just to put the base tone in here, and I'm going to speed this up for you. So you saw me adding some pigment to this, and all I've done is I've added Payne's grey to the existing mix here, and you know how I was just explaining about Payne's grey and indigo having these wonderful properties. So remember that they can be used to add tonal value as well as colour, so keep that in mind. So it's just Payne's grey wash on this one here, and again some of the pigment that had dried on my palette, I just added a little bit of shadow so that we can now start to build up the cupcake. So on my palette here I have a mix of the same 2 colours that I used in the beginning. If you're creating form on a subject, more times than not, the colours that you've already used in a thicker consistency will usually work quite well. So on my palette, being guided by what I've just said, on my palette here with just a little bit more indigo. I've got a darker mix of the initial wash that we used for the icing on the cupcake. Now the icing at the moment is looking very flat, so by adding some of this mixture here and there, and we don't want this to be everywhere, it's just where we want to create a little bit of a shape within the cupcake. Add your colour, and with the brush just blending it in and working through. If you find that it's not quite the right tone, just adjust it as you go along. So I'm going to do the rest of this in time lapse to speed things up for you. So we still have quite a long way to go on this little cupcake. We need to add some texture to the chocolate element, because this is now sort of has a little bit more form, although we still can build on it later. So to add some texture to the chocolate, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a colour to my palette here that you may not have. Now, if you don't have it, don't worry. As I keep saying, these tutorials are all about making art accessible to everybody. I'm using a colour called Piemonte, or is it, do you know, I don't even know how to say it. The colour is called Piemonte Genuine or Piemonte Genuine. It's made by Daniel Smith, and it's a kind of murky, pinky brown tone. If you don't have that colour, which you may not, use any brown that you have and mix it with a tiny bit of any pinky tone. But I'm adding that mix to the existing colour that I have here. And I'm going to start outlining the chocolate of the cupcake. Initially, this will go underneath that icing. Now you'll see where I'm using my brush as I hit the icing to create a little wiggle, and that just accentuates that line there. Cleaning my brush again, patting it onto my kitchen towel, and then just sort of stippling that out and blending that out, because we want that to be obvious where the icing sugar meets that chocolate sponge. And you can see how I'm wiggling the brush and maybe just pulling a few bits down like this to create form. Okay, so it's all about layers with watercolour. And remember, I am working from a reference photograph that I'll put up at the end. A few little wiggles, and we're going to do a water wash on this as well later. So I'm going to speed this up for you. This is Daniel Smith, or Piemonte Genuine. And if you are familiar with this colour and you know how to pronounce it, maybe you can write it phonetically in the comments for this ignorant artist to know how to pronounce. So as you can see, this has now turned this colour into this darker brown. So all I have is the Daniel Smith colour mixed with the Payne's grey to create a more gloopy texture. We can also add a little bit of any brown actually, just to give it a little bit of a chocolatey colour. This is for the paper cup that we see here. Now I'm going to do this in time lapse, but just to show you what I'm doing. And I'm going to use the brush and I'm going to take it right up to the edge of the chocolate sponge itself like this. Just picking up that pigment and going around the chocolate like that. And then pulling it down into the lines of the paper cup to create these little folds that you see within the paper. Now these are going to be just here and there. They're not going to be everywhere. I want to keep it nice and loose, but I'm going to speed this up for you so that we can skip the boring parts. So I did an all over glaze to the paper cup as well, using the same colour but watered down. Now remember with watercolour, going back to the very beginning of this painting where I added the sort of very pale green to the icing element of the cake. When you're thinking about watercolour and you're looking to choose a colour that's very pale, don't go out and buy pale colours. All you need to do is water down a darker colour that you have to get the pale colour. So going back to my watercolour chart here that I have, and I put a link on the screen for this again, I'm looking at the sort of lighter tones within my palette here and using those. You don't need to go out and buy pale colours. Just water down the colours that you have, and certainly don't add white to them. It's all about making the watercolour work for you. Now I have on my palette here some sap green mixed in with a tiny bit of the original mix that I had and on its own, and all I'm going to do is just add some tone to these mint leaves, and I'm going to leave a little bit of a gap in the middle, so a negative painting. So when you paint with me, you'll see that I do a mixture of different application methods, and I think it's important that if you're learning how to paint, that you find a style or application method that suits you. So I'm negatively painting the section in the middle there, and I've applied the paint on that section only. I'm cleaning my brush, patting it on my kitchen towel, and then I'm just spreading it up. I'm going to speed this up for you. So there are a couple of things we need to do to bring this cake to its conclusion. I'm going to sharpen up around the base of where the sponge hits the icing by adding some more of the pigments that we've already used, and a little bit of indigo as well. We want this colour now to be thicker and more gloopier. So Payne's grey or indigo to the brown colour. You can see the consistency that I have here. I'm using a number 2 size brush. What I'm going to do is outline this edge here. So we have a lovely sharp edge where the chocolate sponge hits the ice and sugar. And again, the mint leaf here, this can be sharpened up. Using the tip of this brush, you can see how I'm outlining, sharpening up this mint leaf. Looking at that outline, I'm going to create, as I'm pulling that paint down, I'm just creating form and little circles just to give that chocolate sponge a bit of texture. I'm also going to continue that in time lapse in a moment, but I'm using the same mix to go around the outside of the paper cup, again to enhance the colours that we've put on already. So you saw me there in time lapse, just adding a few final tweaks, and it's really entirely up to you how much detail you put on there. I also did a little bit more texture. You can see here where the paint has dried. I also added another bit of Payne's grey to add a little bit more form and shadow around the icing sugar, because I felt it looked a little bit too flat. But you can play around with it, you can add more detail if you want to. At the end of this video, I'm going to show you the reference photograph that I worked from. So back over to me. So thank you for watching, and I hope that you found this video helpful. If you enjoy this method of painting, you may also want to try this video here where I use a similar technique so that you can practice your skills. As promised, I will put a reference photograph at the end of this video so that you can paint along if you want to. If you like this video, then do remember to give it a thumbs up. It's a free way of letting YouTube know that you like me. Thank you for watching, and until next time.